Mansa, and today we're talking about alternatives to armed police traffic enforcement. We're joined today by Berkeley City Council member Rigel Robinson, who recently sponsored legislation that made Berkeley the first city in the country to remove traffic stops from police jurisdiction. And we're also joined by Cambridge City Councilor Quinton Zondervan, who proposed a similar bill that would transfer traffic enforcement from police to an unarmed non-law enforcement agency. We also have Sarah Sayo, a Columbia Law School professor and author of Policing the Open Road, which examines the history and impact of police encounters during traffic stops. This is a particularly crucial and painful issue right now. Police pull over some 20 million people per year, 50,000 people every day. Traffic stops are in fact responsible for more incidents resulting in death than any other kind of response situation. Black people are about 3 times more likely than white people to be killed by police in a traffic stop encounter. And about 1/10 of all police killings occur during traffic stops. The Stanford Policing Project found that police require less suspicion to search Black or Latinx drivers, and traffic stops by police are one of the major drivers of police-involved killings, disproportionately result in death or harm to Black and Latinx drivers. So traffic enforcement is dangerous to police generally. Most years see more police deaths in traffic-related incidents than other causes. But that danger really pales in comparison to the appalling danger that these encounters cause to community members. No one has forgotten the killing of Philando Castile, a beloved nutrition specialist at a high school in Missouri who was shot during a traffic stop in 2016. And what has changed? 4 years later, the summer of 2020, Rayshard Brooks was shot in Atlanta following a traffic stop. Maurice Gordon was shot in New Jersey during a traffic stop. And today, news is breaking about another shooting in Wisconsin, where Jacob Blake was shot 7 times in the back in front of his 3 children who were watching from the car. Now, to be clear, the Blake shooting was not a traffic stop, or it does not appear to have been a traffic stop. But it's notable in that even in a summer where Americans have taken to the streets to protest police killings, the violence continues, seemingly unabated. Demonstrations against police brutality, specifically toward Black and brown communities, have continued for months. Calls to defund the police and repurpose that funding towards services and alternative enforcement models have continued. Cities are now discussing alternative traffic enforcement as well, including Los Angeles, New York City, Philadelphia, and the DC metro area. So Berkeley, California, recently became the first major city to remove traffic enforcement from police jurisdiction. Across the country, other side, out here in Massachusetts, Cambridge lawmakers have proposed similar civilian traffic enforcement models. Our guests today are going to tell us about why civilian traffic enforcement is so important for public safety, the reason our current traffic policing model fails, and what other cities considering the change should be thinking about. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'd like to start with you, Councilmember Robinson. You proposed legislation in June, passed in July, shifted traffic enforcement from police towards civilians. So I'm hoping you can tell us about the evolution of that conversation, the conversation around that issue over the past few months, and how you went from your proposal in June to the passage in July. Was this something that was on your radar before the protests? And how did your city move so quickly?
Absolutely. It's good to be on the show. Thank you for having us, Emily. We're seeing something in cities all over the country that's never happened at this scale before. Masses of residents calling on their cities to fundamentally redesign, not just reform, how law enforcement works. It's incredible, and I know we all feel it. It's surreal, really, to see so many individuals in my own life, especially who I've never known to speak up about racial justice, calling for some of these big picture changes. It's an awakening and a turning point, and now it's on local elected officials and city governments to ensure that that energy is manifested into the actual change on the ground that people are seeking. To get into the weeds, you framed the issue as well as I can. We're having a nationwide discussion about the role of law enforcement in our society And I believe, and I think we're all here because we believe, that any serious conversation around this work is incomplete without a focus on the single most common interaction that Americans have with police, and that's traffic enforcement. Traffic enforcement, most importantly, which has been the genesis of so many of the most heartbreaking stories that have galvanized the nation around issues of police misconduct. Sandra Bland, Sam DuBose, Philando Castile, Black Americans who should be with us, whose names shouldn't be household names, but who were pulled over by the police. Yeah, so in Berkeley, how did this start? My office has been really lucky to work with an incredible team of policing and transportation advocates who see this as the most essential component of our broader effort to reimagine public safety. The chair of our Transportation Commission, the vice chair of our Police Review Commission, pedestrians and cyclists of color brainstorming what a world with a very different approach to enforcement would look like. And naturally, they found themselves digging into Professor Sarasaw's book, Policing the Open Road. But it's worth noting, none of this is really a new idea. In July 2019, about a year ago, and almost a year before the tragic death of George Floyd, Minneapolis's largest transportation advocacy group, Our Streets in Minneapolis, announced that they actually preferred smarter street design over conventional traffic enforcement as a tool for enhancing street safety, concerned by the racial disparities in enforcement that we see in virtually every major city in the country. So that's what we're working toward. But I should be clear here. No matter what any dramatic headline about our city council meetings might suggest, the city of Berkeley really has not yet removed traffic enforcement from the police. Doing this thoughtfully and effectively will take time and resources. What we have done is take some big first steps in that direction, in addition to a number of other key projects in the world of police reform. But there are significant procedural, organizational, financial, logistical, and legal hurdles that we're still digging into, and we need to work out. We're not going to rush into a new program, rush into a new way of doing things that could put our own employees in danger or jeopardize our ability to keep the public safe. But we have to believe that there's a better way of achieving public safety than what cities have been doing for decades, which has come at the expense of Black people all over the country. So we're talking about some big changes that to really feel on the ground might be a little ways away. And to do any of this, it's essential that we engage with the employees and the existing enforcement units as part of our upcoming community engagement process. Because
okay, so I know you're being really responsible and you're not rushing into this and you're getting feedback from everyone and you're doing this slowly. But now I have to ask, what's the vision? What is this going to look like? How much do you know and how much can you tell us about what the ultimate picture could be?
Fundamentally, this is about raising the threshold of risk that we feel like requires the involvement of armed officers in everyday life. Is an armed officer necessary to pull someone over for a broken taillight, what have you? Maybe there's a way to differentiate between enforcement of criminal versus civil violations of law. What can we do to really differentiate and isolate the American public from the abundance of guns and the use of force that we see too often by law enforcement that disproportionately affects Black people? That said, of course, we alluded to some of the state law limits in other states. That's going to be a hurdle for us too in California, to make sure that we can find ways to enforce law, to make sure that we achieve traffic safety in ways that don't require us to always have an armed officer on the scene, while also protecting the safety of those employees themselves. And say you think about a major arterial that runs through your street. Much of this too is about connecting issues of enforcement with issues of safety to issues of planning. Maybe the best way to deal with speeding issues on one of your main arterials isn't to arbitrarily pull over Black drivers who might be 1 or 2 miles over the speed limit, but to install the traffic calming measures necessary to really design safe streets for all of our communities.
Thank you for that. Okay, so this idea that you've had and that you are beginning down the road on has caught on across the country in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I want to turn to you, Councilmember Zondervan. You're proposing similar legislation in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So I'm hoping you can tell us what the path is for you to enacting those changes, and also how you've responded to opponents of this proposal.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks to Rigel for his pioneering work in Berkeley. We're often sister cities, pursuing similar ideas. So I put in a proposal to take away traffic enforcement from the police and put it into a civilian agency. Unlike Berkeley, we already have a transportation and traffic department, which seems like a natural home for what we're trying to do here. And the proposal hasn't been voted on yet. We will do that in a few weeks in early September. But I did have an opportunity to speak with a lawyer about the legal obstacles, because those have been raised. And what we figured out based on that conversation is, in his opinion anyway, it seems that only the police in Massachusetts can issue a citation like a speeding ticket. However, there are opportunities for civilian staff members to observe an infraction and report it to the police, or to directly communicate with the person, with the driver. So for example, Rigel brought up a broken taillight, which, let's be honest, right? These types of traffic stops have been used historically in this country as part of our racist war on drugs to persecute and oppress primarily Black and brown communities. So what we want to do is shift that away from the police, right? So if we had a civilian staff person who observed that someone had a broken taillight, they could issue a letter directly to the owner of that vehicle based on the license registration plate and inform them that, there's a problem with your vehicle and you may want to get it repaired, right? And that doesn't preclude someone else from ultimately enforcing that if it becomes a bigger issue, but it's just a much gentler way to interact with our residents. And another example that really plays big in Cambridge, and I'm sure in Berkeley as well, is that we have a lot of bicyclists, right? We have a lot of people who commute and ride bicycles, and we've been putting in place a lot of bike lanes on our streets, but they're not always protected from the traffic. And so sometimes people pull over into the bike lane and obstruct it. And currently that's not really being enforced to the level that we would like to see it enforced. Now, again, that doesn't require an armed officer to go up to someone and say, hey, you're causing a safety issue here. Would you mind moving along? And even maybe giving them some directions to an alternative spot where they can conduct their business. Similar with idling vehicles, which is another issue that just clearly does not rise to the level of involving armed enforcement agents, but needs to be communicated to the driver that it is Massachusetts state law. You can't idle unnecessarily for more than 5 minutes. So again, it's a great example where we could have civilian agency members informing a driver that that you are causing a minor problem and here's how to fix it. And many of us have done that, even as civilians ourselves interacted with someone and help them correct the situation. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here, and I completely agree with Rigel that it's not overnight. We're not going to flip a switch and all of a sudden all traffic enforcement is handled in some different way. We have to build up to it. We have to experiment a little bit. We have to try different things and see what works, and ultimately get ourselves to a better place where we reduce these incidents and these dangerous interactions, which are stressful for both the driver and for the police, And by reducing those interactions, we're actually immediately reducing harm for everyone.
So I have a quick follow-up about how you're responding to opponents. I know some opponents have said that Massachusetts state law, which privately, I have admired Massachusetts state law for the number of incredibly strange and arcane rules still on the books in Massachusetts. If anybody wants a real chuckle, they can just Google outdated Massachusetts state laws. But some people are saying that this isn't possible under state law. And I'm also wondering what other pushback you may have heard from law enforcement groups, from people who perhaps are very committed to this war on drugs mentality of utilizing traffic stops for, for ulterior motives. How do you respond to all of that?
Yeah, so in terms of the legal question, I'm not a lawyer, but in that interaction with our legal advisors, we did come to the conclusion that, again, really the only limitation is the issue of a citation that has to be done by a police officer. But the police officer doesn't have to directly witness the infraction. So there can be civilian agents who can observe that something happened and can inform the police if necessary to issue a citation. But again, in many of these situations, like a broken taillight, we don't have to immediately jump to a citation. We could go to inform, we could go to education. So there are intermediate steps that clearly are well within our legal capabilities to enact. And then in terms of opponents, and particularly people who want to continue to press the war on drugs, we utterly reject that. Massachusetts has legalized cannabis. Myself and the current mayor are responsible for some far-reaching equity laws that we passed last term to protect people and create opportunities for people who have been harmed by the war on drugs. And ultimately, this is part of our bigger effort to reimagine public safety of the 21st century. So we're also looking at police use of force, military weapons, there's, and reallocating parts of the police budget. So
absolutely. So Professor Sayo, I want to pull you in on this because as we're talking about reimagining in the 21st century, I'd like you to kind of walk us up to how we got here. You just published this amazing book on the racist history of police traffic enforcement. How did this system of armed officers stopping people for things like idling for more than 5 minutes, how did we get here? Oh, you are still muted. You got to hit your mute button.
Sure. So I want to make two simple historical points that explain how we got here and also give you a reason why I, as a historian, support this proposal. And so the first historical point is about how police discretionary powers changed over the 20th century. And it's tied to the mass production and adoption of the automobile. So when cars were mass produced, they immediately created chaos, death, and destruction on highways and streets. And so local governments throughout the country responded by passing a lot of traffic laws. And the enforcement of all of those traffic laws fell to the police department. This immediately raised an enforcement problem because everybody behind the wheel violated the traffic laws like they still do today. All of us have sped, right? And also these drivers got really upset when they were pulled over for a traffic violation. And this resulted in, first of all, a public relations problem for the police department. They became really unpopular from the motoring public who didn't like to be pulled over and told they violated the law. And it also posed a rule of law problem because you had ordinarily law-abiding citizens who violated the traffic laws every time they got behind the wheel. And so local governments throughout the country did two things. One is they gave more power to police officers. For example, they made it a crime to disobey a traffic command. And then to handle the public relations headache of managing the relationship with the motoring public, officers were trained to exercise discretion. So even though the law allowed them, for example, to make an arrest for a traffic violation, they were trained to give leniency if the situation wasn't that serious. And so in the early years of the automobile, most of the people who owned and drove cars were white people who could afford to buy a car. By the late 1930s, especially after World War II, Black drivers started to own and drive cars in greater numbers. And so around that time is when Black drivers started writing letters to the NAACP saying, I'm being harassed, abused, my rights violated when I'm pulled over. So in the automobile's early years, in the 1920s and early 30s, police discretion meant giving drivers lenient treatment. When Black drivers were pulled over in the 30s, 40s, and throughout the 20th century after that, police discretion for them meant harassment and abuse when they were pulled over. So discretion can be used in lenient ways and in harassing ways. And that's why we have two very different traffic stop experiences by race, which is documented statistically even today. So that's the first point about how police discretion changed and grew over the 20th century because of the need to enforce traffic laws. Now, the second point I want to make is that in the 20th century, American culture became a car society. American society became a car culture, I should say. And so the police, or I should also mention that as American society became mobile, the commission of crime became mobile too. And so in addition to enforcing traffic laws, the police were enforcing criminal laws too. And that's how we get two very different traffic stops. You have the routine traffic stop and the investigatory traffic stop. And you add on to that the discretion that the police have. And so the police can exercise their discretion to treat a driver either as a routine traffic violator or as a potential criminal suspect. And that's why we have two very different traffic experiences, a routine traffic stop or the investigatory stop. And what's really interesting is based on the data that we have that's available from public records, routine traffic stops are not as dangerous as investigatory traffic stops. It's the investigatory traffic stops that begin with a pretextual minor traffic violation that pose a lot of danger to both officers and the drivers and car passengers. And so really this proposal to separate traffic law enforcement with criminal law enforcement is to get at de-escalating the traffic stop, making it more about public safety and not about criminal investigation. You asked the question to Councilmember Zondervan, what about pushback from law enforcement quarters saying this is going to undermine their criminal investigations, especially in the war on drugs? I completely agree with Councilmember Zondervan's answer. And I would add to that the investigatory traffic stop that starts with a minor traffic violation, it actually is very ineffective in finding criminal evidence. And so you have a very ineffective investigative tool that's prone to abuse. It's prone to violate people's constitutional rights. There's really no need to further engage in this practice.
So it's a really interesting point you make, right? That you're not getting a lot of bang for your buck. It's not really increasing public safety. It's not leading to any big investigatory breakthroughs. It is resulting in a lot of death. And I wanted you to sort of go into one area that you touched on in your book about how the rise of these dichotomies of traffic enforcement has contributed to the American public's sort of widespread expectation of and acceptance of pervasive police power in a way that's very different from the way police operate in other countries. So can you tell us about what influence traffic enforcement has had on our relationship with the police and how that has gotten us to the state of policing we have today?
Sure. So there's several ways to answer your question. One is that the need to provide for public safety on the roads and highways is a very real need, and it's a legitimate exercise of the government's power. The reason why local governments throughout the country added and enacted more traffic laws, the reason why they added more police officers or traffic cops to their police forces, the reason why they gave them more powers was because there was a lot of death and destruction on roads and highways from the automobile. And so you have a legitimate need to provide for public safety on the one hand. But on the other hand, you have the difficulty of enforcing all of those laws, which is why the police were given more discretion. And so part of the reason why we're seeing a lot of debate around this issue today is because Americans and individuals in this country experience very different traffic stops, largely based on race. And so for those people who are often allowed to go off with just a warning or a traffic ticket, it is really eye-opening to hear stories about people of color who are pulled over experiencing something very different. I think we see that reckoning. We've seen that this year when with the protests, more and more people reading these tragic stories, understanding that what they're experiencing might not be what everybody else is experiencing during a traffic stop.
Thank you for bringing up the public perception aspect of it, because we are now in panel mode where anybody can answer any of these questions. Please treat your mute button like a buzzer in a game show. But so I would like to bring up this report, Professor Seo, that you just wrote for the Justice Collaborative Institute and Data for Progress. And it includes polling that indicates that a majority of likely voters support these initiatives. They support reallocating traffic enforcement duties from armed officers to unarmed non-police agencies and traffic cameras and other like automated mechanisms of improving safety. So I'd love to hear from each of you. Perhaps we'll start with the council members and then go back to the author of the report who may have all the answers at the end. But how do you think the public understanding of these police stops has changed, and how has public pressure been felt by you or by your governing body? And we'll start with you, Councilmember Robinson, and then go to you, Councilmember Zondervan.
It's been transformed. We're leading parallel lives. I never had to have the talk. My parents never had to sit me down and explain to me what to do with my hands after I've been pulled over, how to talk to an officer in that situation. That is not a legitimate fear or expectation that has ever existed in my life. Has not been an entity I've had to navigate around. And for a lot of Black Americans in this country, their relationship to this issue is the literal exact opposite. And over the last few months, especially, there's been such a profound discourse about the tiny little differences in our lives that add up so quickly, and that are a product of the racism that governs this country, really. So I think in a lot of ways, people are becoming more aware of their own privilege and how systems that may seem to be designed to be colorblind really can still have disparate impacts based on race. And there's a lot of potential solutions to that I think in a lot of ways are really intuitive. You mention cameras and automated enforcement, which I think eventually is going to have to be a really significant part of this conversation. You look to these incidents, this headline that's become too regular of a traffic stop gone wrong, and you think about the root causes that can tackle that. It's first the bias in the act of pulling someone over in the first place, who you decide to enforce the law against, and secondly the potential of that interaction, the potential of that enforcement action to become violent. When you're looking at that potential for violence, changing the sort of officer, the sort of employee that's actually engaging that stop, whether or not they're armed or not, is a potential answer. But when you look to the bias question, the most effective tool for ensuring safety on our streets, real safety, is largely automated enforcement and traffic cameras. And in many states all over the country, those are literally illegal. That is not a tool in our toolkit here in California. And naturally, there's equity questions you would need to answer about placement of cameras, but in the way that an officer can see two cars pass by committing the exact same violation of the law, but choose to pursue one of them, a camera doesn't make that distinction. And someday, that's going to be a big lift in this arc as we try to really build equity into how traffic enforcement works from coast to coast.
Councilmember Robinson, I want to fold your answer into the question for our other guests, actually, because that question of how automating this thing could result in the automation of other things, I think is a really great question. I mean, if we're seeing robust support among voters for this, and we're not talking about adding on robots, we're not saying police and more cameras and all of this. We're saying let's do, I shouldn't use the word robots, it's scary. Let's do, cameras and automated mechanisms instead of potentially biased, violent, armed officers. I'd love for our other guests to touch on, before we wrap, what other traditional police functions could be handed over to safer forms of automation or non-police agencies?
Well, I can weigh in on that, because the other part of our conversation here in Cambridge has been around a program that we've seen in Oregon called Cahoots, where there is a mental health first response agency that steps in instead of the police when it makes sense. And we actually recently had an incident in Cambridge just a few weeks ago where a young man was destroyed. He distraught. He was African American, and he found out that his mother had passed away, and he tried to enter his mother's home, and he was blocked by 6 police officers, and it turned into a video recorded interaction that, thankfully didn't end in any major violence, but it was still clearly an example of a situation where it made no sense for the police to be the first responders in that incident. And to answer your earlier question about the public response, back in June when we were talking about reallocating part of the police budget, at the meeting where we were discussing that, we had 400 people signed up for public comment. And for context, if we have 30 or 40 people signed up for public comment, we consider that a lot. We've never had that many people signed up for public comment on any issue, and 99% of them spoke in favor of reallocating the police budget. So it is absolutely, as Rigel said, this is a moment of reckoning with our racist system, and we're going to have to look at everything we do. One of the criticisms that I get is people say, well, what about the school department? They're racist too. And I'll say, yes, you're absolutely right. We have to look at everything that we do. We have to adopt what Ibram Kendi calls an anti-racist approach, where we are actively looking at these systems, as Rigel says, that we've just accepted and we're comfortable with, and this is just the way it's done. And now we have to look at it and say, no, it's not acceptable to continue in this manner. And we have to look at how all these systems interact, mass incarceration, the use of force policies, all of these different pieces interact to produce systemic oppression. And this is really a moment where we can begin to undo that and to really examine that more closely to see if we can get to a more just and equitable society ultimately.
Professor Sayo, I'm going to turn to you to close out the show. And I'd love for you to just discuss the council members' responses, as well as what potential benefits you see to our community relationship with our cities, our states, our government, from changes like those being brought by these 2 council members.
Sure, and I can answer your question by bringing it full circle almost. Council members Zondervan's proposal in Cambridge about civilian traffic law enforcement kind of brings us back to the early 20th century, because before the police really handled much of traffic law enforcement on streets and highways, it was actually civilians did a lot of it before the police got all of their powers to manage traffic enforcement. And the reason why it was shifted from civilian to police, and civilians were no longer allowed to, was because of how difficult the task was of enforcing traffic laws and pulling people over. And local governments decided that's a really hard task that should be reserved for the police only. And so one of the questions that I think this history poses, it offers a suggestion, or it offers a proposal or a solution for fixing today's racist law enforcement problem. But it also offers a warning that civilian traffic law enforcement is not going to be an end-all be-all. There's some pitfalls to civilian traffic law enforcement. And I think one of the reasons why we're seeing a switch or a shift in public opinion about things like automated traffic law enforcement and non-police enforcement of traffic laws is because people are seeing the connection between police enforcement of traffic laws and the disparate, unequal policing that we're dealing with today. And so part of my proposal in the report that was published by the Justice Collaborative is to launch a public education campaign informing the public that their cooperation with traffic laws when they're pulled over to cooperate and not be combative in their responses is part of the solution to not relying on the police to do this task. That we can have non-police officers who don't have all the powers that law enforcement do to handle traffic law enforcement as a routine civil administrative process. And so it's really on local governments to enact change. It's on the new enforcers, whoever they may be, whichever agency they may be, whether they're civilians or administrative bureaucrats. And it's on the motoring public as well. It's on all of us to make this safer roads and highways for all of our citizens and those who live in this country.
Thank you so much for that closing thought. And thank you so much to our guests. I think it's such a privilege to consider how in this moment of so much crisis and shared vulnerability and shared pain as a country and as a society, we can find these bright spots of creativity and of innovation and of new solutions and smarter thinking and transformation. So thank all of you for your work on transformation. It's been an absolute privilege to host you here. Thank you so much for joining me. This has been The Briefing, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal, and I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. Thank you so much for joining us.